Okay, that looks like it's up and running there, Vlad.
Yep, it's live now.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, so let's make a start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture in our this year's installment of Edinburgh Lectures in Language Evolution. Our speaker today is Richard Futrell, and we're going to be joined by Martin Haspelmatt and Shira Tal for the panel discussion. So I'll introduce Richard in a second. Just in case you don't know the format, we're going to have a talk from Richard, and then we'll have a panel discussion, quick Q&A between Richard, Martin, and Shira. And then we'll open the floor to questions from the in-person and online audience. If you're online, you can ask a question in the Q&A on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, there should be a question box, and we'll try and catch those with some assistance from Vlad. Okay, so as I said, our speaker today is Richard Futrell. He is an associate professor in the Department of Language Science at UC Irvine, where he leads the language processing group. Richard got his PhD in 2017 from MIT, working with Ted Gibson and Roger Levy. He applies information theory to natural language, using it to measure things like to what extent are natural languages redundant, to what extent do their grammars embody factors that make them more efficient to process or better for efficient communication. I think his work first came to our attention. It's actually one of his first papers, a 2015 paper in PNAS, where they were looking at a large cross-linguistic corpus and were able to show that the grammars of natural languages seem to be optimized to minimize dependency length, which facilitates processing for speakers and hearers. That's the kind of stuff we like, and we were impressed by his methods and his smart baselines he used in that paper, and so I've been following his career ever since. He's broadened that approach, applies information theory to a number of aspects of language, and he's going to tell us about some of that work today. Just to note, I think he's going to talk about this today too, that Richard was an author on a paper that won the Best Paper prize at ACL this year, using neural networks to look at learnability of impossible languages. And he's going to tell us a bit about that later on. Okay, so before I hand over to Richard, I just want to share a comment, a summary of Richard that I got from Ted Gibson. So this was Ted Gibson, who was one of Richard's PhD supervisors, was visiting Edinburgh a long time ago, like 2014 or 2015 or something. And we were talking about the amazing cohort of PhD students he was working with at that time, including Richard. And so Ted's summary of Richard was that he has profound insights into natural language that you only really get if you have a deep and thorough understanding of the maths of information theory. I think I've seen some of the stuff that Richard's going to talk about today, and I think that's a very nice summary of the kind of work he does and the kind of work he's going to tell us about today that offers profound insights into how natural languages work. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Richard now. And Richard, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Here we go.
Yeah, looks good. The floor is yours.
All right, Kenny, thanks for the very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. I've always liked the Edinburgh community. I remember I visited in 2016, and so it's great to be back in some sense. So here we go. I'm going to be taking an approach to natural language which is inspired by approaches that have been taken in other areas of cognitive science. And in particular, we're going to be thinking about language in terms of a way of thinking about cognition that was advocated for vision originally. So this guy, David Marr, wrote this book called Vision, in which he proposes a theory of how he thinks the visual system works. And his sort of guiding philosophy part of it is given by this kind of quote. He says, trying to understand perception like vision by studying only neurons is like trying to understand bird flight by studying only feathers. It just cannot be done. In order to understand bird flight, we have to understand aerodynamics. Only then do the structure of the feathers and the different shapes of birds' wings make sense. So in other words, if you're trying to understand these things, birds' wings, you have to understand this stuff. You have to understand aerodynamics, which defines the constraints that the system operates under. So taking a functional view of a cognitive system like vision, thinking about what is the problem it's solving and what are the inherent constraints that it is under, that gives you organizing principles that let you understand how the system actually works in a way that you couldn't just by looking at individual neurons or individual feathers. So what would it mean to apply this to language? We have to now ask the question, what is natural language from this functional point of view? And I advocate that we should think about language as a sort of communication system that enables a kind of communication that looks like this. Can you see my mouse? Okay, so you have some agent A who's a human like me. Until very recently, all language was produced by humans. And so you have language is produced. So you have an agent like me who has some thoughts, and I have to convert those thoughts into language, into utterances in real time and speak them. I say them, I produce language in some modality, I send it out to you, you're some agent B, and you can then decode that utterance and to guess what you think my intended meaning was. And you can use that same language to speak back to me. And so it enables communication among agents who are humans. And so crucially, it has to operate under the constraint that you have to be able to actually speak and you have to be able to actually comprehend, given the actual cognitive limitations that humans have. That's the equivalent of like the aerodynamics, I think, for language. It's the cognitive constraints that humans have. So taking an information theory view of a communication system, you get this kind of picture. This is the picture from the original information theory paper. So in order to analyze any communication system, you think about it in terms of these parts. You have an information source that's like a probability distribution over messages or meanings or intents or whatever it is you're encoding using your communication system. You convert those messages into signals, which are like utterances. Then those utterances are received by someone and then decoded to get at the original message or meaning or intent. That first step, the encoding step, is what we call production in psycholinguistics. It happens in real time. It's how you convert your thought into a series of motor actions that produce like an acoustic signal or a written signal or a visual signal. And then the decoding part of that corresponds to comprehension. And so basically, I think these two parts of the communication chain are where there are extremely non-trivial cognitive constraints on how language can work. So, why do we not talk to each other like modems or something? It's because we would not be able to actually produce those signals. We would not be able to actually comprehend those signals. Furthermore, the whole system has to operate under the constraint that you have to learn it pretty fast from data, which is not usually what's considered in information theory. And so basically, these are 3 points of constraint. I'm going to be talking about language processing throughout this talk. I want to be clear that when I say processing, I actually mean that to include both comprehension and production. I have a lot of thoughts on learning. I'm happy to, that's not really in the slides. I'm happy to talk about it in questions. I think it's actually very, very important and somewhat parallel to the stuff I'll be presenting about processing. So the idea here is that we want to think about language in terms of the function it's when we think about language in terms of its function, we end up with a picture like this. If you want to try to capture the typology or the patterns of possible languages that we see in the world, you can imagine just the space of all conceivable languages, just like all possible mappings from form to meaning. You can imagine scoring them using some function J of a language L, which would end up looking like this, such that like the minima of the score, the good languages would be like the languages that we actually find, and the maxima would be things that are not really possible human languages. And taking the functional approach, this function should look something like you score a language based on some measure of its complexity in terms of comprehension, production, and learning, and its informativity, which is how well it actually lets you communicate. So you can sort of see this talk as trying to define this complexity term. What is the complexity term that's sort of minimized in languages? And we want a complexity term that is actually grounds out in real cognitive constraints that we can measure independently. We don't want to just make stuff up and throw it in the complexity term. It should all be independently motivated. So we get a research program that has like two sides of a coin. On one side of the coin in this research program, we want to figure out what are the cognitive constraints on language. What are the actual psycholinguistic constraints that we can measure? The other side of the coin is we want models of language structure based on minimizing these measures of complexity coming from our cognitive constraints. And what we're going to see in this talk concretely is that memory constraints, that's the main cognitive constraint we're thinking about, memory constraints in online processing lead to various kinds of locality in human language. Locality meaning that elements that are relevant to each other are close to each other. And as we go through the talk, we're going to actually refine that notion of locality to make it more and more precise and powerful. And we're going to see that increasingly powerful models of the constraints on language actually give us more powerful and precise models of language itself. And so I think that's evidence that this kind of approach is on the right track. Basically, as our memory model gets more principled, our model of what language looks like actually gets better. And so that's a good sign. So let's go to it. First, we're building up this idea of locality. It's getting more and more powerful. The first thing we'll look at is dependency locality, which Kenny actually mentioned. So dependency locality, we're just going to start by thinking about it in terms of the constraints on language, the processing constraints on language. So I'm going to show you some sentences, and I want you to think about like how easy they are to understand. Here's a sentence: the apartment was well decorated. I think you can agree this is pretty easy, right? So let's all give that a thumbs up in the audience. And you can see that there's a dependency. There's a syntactic dependency in this sentence between the main verb was and the subject of that verb, apartment. Here's another sentence. The apartment that the maid cleaned was well decorated. What do you think? Thumbs up, thumbs down? I'd say it's still a thumbs up. And now there's more dependencies, and they're somewhat more complex and nested and longer. So now we have the apartment was well decorated, and that's spanning this intervening relative clause. Now, how about this? The apartment that the maid or the service sent over cleaned was well decorated. How do people feel about this? A thumbs up or a thumbs down? I can't actually see the audience. So typically people feel kind of mixed about this. And I can tell you, if I didn't build this up piece by piece, you would probably not really be able to understand this sentence. So people, especially if you're showing the sentence without building it up piece by piece, this is going to be a big time thumbs down. If you found this in a book that you're reading or something, you're going to have to read it many times to understand it. And the dependencies involved here are very long. If you look at the reading times associated with this kind of sentence, you can look at the word by word reading times. What you see is that the trouble starts right here at the second verb here, cleaned. So this is the part where people start to feel confused as they are comprehending this sentence. And we think part of the reason why this sentence sounds weird and bad and is hard to understand is because of these long dependencies. The idea is basically when you get to this verb cleaned, you have to think like, okay, what's the subject of this verb? What's the object of this verb? You have to retrieve this stuff from the beginning of the sentence from memory. And that memory retrieval might be difficult or it might be inaccurate because these things are far away and because there's lots of interfering similar things, but mostly because they're far away. You can tell that the sentence is hard because of the dependency structure and not because of the meaning, because I can just rewrite it in a way that expresses approximately the same meaning, but now with shorter dependencies, and now it's very easy to understand. The well-decorated apartment was cleaned by the maid that was sent over by the service. Right. So this is dependency locality. The idea is, and this is well attested, that it's difficult to comprehend utterances with long dependencies, long syntactic dependencies. This is not only in comprehension, you also find this in production, where sentences with long dependencies are associated with like disfluencies and pauses and stuff. So it's not only comprehension. This is a very real measurable effect. So if you look at sentences like this, where we are taking this verb supervised and we're successively making it farther and farther away from administrator here, which is its object outside the relative clause, then you get increasing reading times on the verb, corresponding to the fact that it's like harder and harder to retrieve the relevant stuff from memory the longer this dependency gets. So dependency locality, very well established as a processing constraint on language. Like long dependencies are associated with difficulty for reasons of memory. And now we flip the coin and we say, what does this tell us about language? What does this give us in terms of a model of linguistic structure? And it gives us a very simple idea. It tells us that words that are linked in syntactic dependencies like this should be close to each other in their linear order. So word order should be structured to keep things close together, on average, closer than they would be by chance, in order to avoid this difficulty in processing. Now I'm going to show evidence based on large-scale linguistic corpora that this is true, that the word orders of languages are structured in a way that keeps related words together, syntactically related words together. I'm going to be showing evidence based on these dependency tree bank corpora. I'll be using these corpora throughout the talk, actually. So these are data sets of many languages that have been assembled by something called the Universal Dependencies Project. The idea is to annotate as many languages as you can in terms of a unified syntactic formalism. And these are corpora of naturalistic text. You get sentences like this. It says like, I ran across this item on the internet. And so you have labels where you're marking syntactic dependencies from head to dependent, or you can think about that from head to modifier, with various useful labels. And the data sources for this are heterogeneous across the languages, but it's mostly written data. But the point is just we have large corpora of text that are annotated for their syntactic structure in this way. And now we want to use these to find evidence for this idea of dependency locality. Here's something we can do. We can take a sentence from the corpus. Here's a sentence from the English Universal Dependencies corpus. And we can measure the lengths of all of its syntactic dependencies, which we do here as the sum of the lengths in words of each dependency. So the total dependency length for this sentence is 6. And that's like, you can think of that number 6 as like an index of how much processing difficulty you're going to have for this sentence because of your memory constraints. We can take that sentence and we can plot it in a space like this. It's a sentence of length 6, so meaning it has 6 words. So that's a sentence of length 6 with dependency length 6. And then we can plot the average dependency length per sentence length for the entire corpus. That gives you a curve. This curve is like characteristic of the English language. It's telling you, again, how much processing difficulty you're experiencing because of dependency locality in the English language because of the word order of the English language. Now we want to show that the word order rules of English are configured in a way that makes English easier to comprehend and produce than it would be otherwise. So we need to now compare this curve to something that tells us what would the English language look like if there were no dependency locality. And that brings us to one of our random baselines. So you can take the English sentence and rearrange it in lots of different ways. So here I've rearranged the sentence randomly in a number of ways while respecting the constraint that the dependency lines are not crossing each other. This is the same as assuming that it's still following a context-free grammar. What these samples are telling you is if the word order rules of English were different, if English had different word order rules, what would the dependency length of that sentence look like? And it would look like these. And you can plot that in the same space. And what you get is that the actual English has shorter dependencies for every sentence length than you would expect under these other ways, other kinds of word order that you could have in English. And you can keep playing this game and come up with lots of different baselines that are reflecting different independently motivated constraints that you might expect to exist on grammars. And what you find is that the actual English language has shorter dependencies than all of them. So for whatever random grammars you can come up with, they tend to give you dependencies that are longer than what you have in the actual way that English is configured. And then we can generalize that now to 54 languages, just doing exactly the same analysis. And what you find is that all of the languages have significantly shorter dependencies than all of the random baselines. Now, one thing you notice looking at this, I've noticed people like to look at this, and I'm happy in questions. I'm happy to talk about like the typological factors that influence whether you have longer or shorter dependencies. I think the main thing you notice is that although all languages are optimized relative to the baselines, they differ in how much they are. So like English is very optimized here relative to the baselines. Something like German is less so. And there's a lot of interesting variance there to discuss. But the first order point here to make is just that all the languages are optimized. They do differ in how much they're optimized. So that's dependency locality, the idea that words linked in dependencies should be close to each other. How is it that languages actually accomplish this? What are the kinds of word order patterns that minimize dependency length? It turns out these actually correspond to well-known sort of universals of word order across languages. So for example, in languages that are predominantly head initial, it's usual to put short constituents before long constituents. Like we do this in English. We have heavy NP shifts. We like to have short constituents before long constituents, and we'll even break the usual word order rules in order to accomplish that. And that minimizes dependency length. If you have a head final language like Japanese, you would actually want long before short ordering, and you do find that in Japanese, and that supports dependency locality. The other big way that you can get short dependencies is to have consistency in your language regarding your branching direction. So being predominantly head initial or predominantly head final, these are both good because they give you short dependencies like this. If you have mixed head directions, which does exist in some languages, but is rare, if you have mixed ordering in terms of head direction or in terms of branching direction, then you're going to get longer dependencies. So these are the kinds of typological things that support this overall effective dependency locality. So we've thought about constraints on language, and we thought about constraints on language and models of language structure that follow from that. We saw that a very simple model of memory in language processing leads to a very simple locality principle, which is that words linked in dependency should be close. So it's like if you imagine a sentence like this, you imagine these dependency links are defining words that want to be close to each other. And that's dependency locality so far. It does seem to be a universal property of languages. Moving on, now we're going to upgrade from dependency locality into information locality, which is going to be more powerful. We're going to start by thinking again about what are the cognitive constraints on language. And we're going to think about where do these dependency locality effects really come from in terms of a more complete processing model. So we got dependency locality from this just very easy observation that like long dependencies correspond to memory difficulty. But how do you get that from a more principled model? Turns out that's going to lead us to a more powerful principle called information locality. So when we try to think about a bigger picture of language processing, the thing that becomes unavoidable when you start looking at the psycholinguistic literature is that language processing is fundamentally entwined with prediction, especially comprehension, but also production. So, for example, if you imagine looking at a scene like this, and then someone's telling you what's going on, someone might say something like, "The boy will eat the cake." When you're comprehending that utterance, your eyes will actually move towards the cake here before you actually hear the word cake. They'll move towards the cake once you hear the word eat. You see that in an eye tracking time course here from Altman and Kamide, a classic study. So when you're hearing the verb eat, you're already starting to look towards that cake. And so this shows prediction. You don't have to wait till you hear the word cake to realize that the cake is the thing that's going to be being eaten here. So you're using world knowledge in this case to make predictions about upcoming linguistic input. Language comprehension is deeply entwined with incremental production of upcoming words and content. This happens in production as well. When things are unpredictable, you have disfluencies and so on. If we take this idea of prediction really seriously, that leads us to an idea of language processing, which is fundamentally information theoretic. And I'm going to show you why. So taking an information theoretic view of language processing means now we're starting to think about what is that actual information that's transmitted in that loop between agent B and agent B? Or what is the information transmitted through the signal? What is the actual information that I'm getting through to you when I'm speaking right now? And I'm going to illustrate the sort of core principle of information theory here with an example. I'm going to show you a sentence prefix, and I want people to shout out what's the word that you think is coming next. Children went outside to... I can't actually hear anything. Did people say play?
Everyone said play.
Yeah, it's unanimous. It's the children absolutely went outside to play. Okay, how about this one? The children came inside to
Sleep.
then you get a big distribution. You get a big uncertain, like people do, it's not, they might be coming inside to play, right? So the point here is that when you said the children went outside to play, and this was completely predictable, there was not much information actually being conveyed by this word in this context, right? Because you already saw it coming. Like it would have been really surprising if I said something else, but when I say play, it's really not very surprising. Whereas when I say they came inside to play, this is less predictable in that context. And so it's actually giving you more information in that context. The amount of information is the amount of surprise. This is the fundamental idea of information theory. So if you think about the information conveyed by this word in this context, like this is the information here in binary digits, it's actually less than the information conveyed by the same word in a different context because it was less predictable here. And information theory formalizes this in terms of something called surprisal. The amount of information in a word or in any event depends on how surprising it is in context. And the surprisal of a word in context is just the negative log probability of a word in context. It's a function that looks like this. So a really high probability word conveys zero information, 0 bits of information. As the probability goes down, a lower probability word is conveying more and more information. A probability 0 word, if it really happened, would convey infinite information. And so you try not to assign probabilities of literally 0. So this is the fundamental intuition and mathematical basis for information theory. This way of thinking gives you a very good predictive model of language processing. It turns out that the amount of difficulty in comprehending a word as you're reading, at least, is closely related to the surprisal, the information content of the word. So you can actually predict the reading time for a word in its context as linearly, just as a linear factor times the surprisal of the word given the context. So if you strap people into an eye tracker and then have them read a text like this, you get a lot of information from looking at this time course. But the main thing you can look at is just how long do you look at each word before you move on to the next word. And it turns out that is very well predicted by just the surprisal, the information content, how much information there is in the word, which is determined by how predictable the word is given its context. So this idea actually has a name. It's called surprisal theory. It just says that your processing difficulty is just basically equal to your surprisal. And you get fits like this when you're fitting the reading times from the eye trackers. So these are as close to linear fits as you're ever going to get in psycholinguistics. This is a quite impressive fit to data. Surprisal theory not only predicts reading times, it also predicts N400 signals in EEG. I do want to have a caveat that this doesn't account for all data on language processing, but it accounts for a lot. So it basically seems like this idea of information theoretic prediction is deeply entwined with what you're doing during incremental comprehension. And as an aside, I am going to have something to say about language models at the end. We've all dealt with them quite a bit. So what do you get if you just train a gigantic neural network to minimize surprisal, to minimize the surprisal of a word given a context? That is exactly how you get to these things like ChatGPT that we all deal with nowadays. So there's a deep connection between how humans are comprehending language and how language models are trained to comprehend language, and we'll come back to that later. Okay, now the idea was we're going to try to get at these locality effects, taking this predictive view, right? So now we're going to do that. So surprisal theory says the processing complexity for a word is just its surprisal given its context. It's how unpredictable, how surprising a word is given its context. So we think about these kinds of things. The apartment that the maid or the cleaning service sent over cleaned. In surprisal, you're thinking about, okay, you have a context, which is this, and then you're trying to predict the next word from that context. And the harder it is to predict, the more difficulty you have. That's the idea. Surprisal theory on its own actually does not account for the locality effect here. So if you just use a strong language model like GPT, it actually has no problem predicting this word. It actually does not predict any particular difficulty for this word in this context. And that's because the artificial language models have better memory than humans do. So what's actually going on in actual human comprehension is something more like this. There is a real context, the things that you actually heard or read. That gives rise to a memory representation of that context. So in this case, maybe like you kind of don't remember the words that happened a long time ago or that you read a long time ago in your memory representation. And then you're predicting the next word from the memory. You're not predicting the next word from the real context, you're predicting it from the memory. So now we're going to say the complexity for a word in context is the surprisal, how unpredictable a word is, given your memory for the context. And when we do that, we get something like this. Your actual surprisal for a word given your lossy memory representation is just equal to the surprisal for the word as if you had a perfect memory representation, plus some extra cost, plus some extra memory cost. And that's where your locality effects are going to come from. And I'll show that exactly. You're going to actually get a generalized form of dependency locality effects out of this. So this is making a simplifying assumption that you're just losing information in your memory at a constant rate as you go back in time. We're going to revise that assumption later, but that's a simple assumption we can make for now. And then the actual expression you get for processing complexity for a word given your memory looks like this. The difficulty you're going to experience for a word is its surprisal in context, how unpredictable it is in context, plus your memory cost. This is a sum over all the words in the context of the distance between that word in the context and the current word, weighted by this thing called mutual information. Mutual information is the most general statistical measure of how strongly two values or two random variables predict each other. So it's a log probability ratio. You could also think about it as a difference in surprisal. It's just the most general measure of how strongly two things predict each other. I find it's easier to explain this formula with the example. So let's think about the apartment that they made or the service sent over cleaned. In the world of dependency locality, we were just thinking about the syntactic dependencies between this verb cleaned and the previous context. So the apartment is important, the maid is important for predicting this word cleaned. Now, following this formula, we actually are going to think about all of the predictive relationships between the context words and this current word. So every word in the context is giving you some predictive information about this next word. And the actual weight of that predictive information is given by the mutual information here. So the thickness of, or the color of these lines corresponds to the mutual information. And then you imagine you have lossy memory. So you're in a situation like this. And if you had a really predictive word back here, you've forgotten about it, or it's not accessible to you. It's probably not that you forgot about it. It's actually just inaccessible to you. And so it ends up not being available to predict this word cleaned. And so that word ends up being proportionally more surprising. So this is the information locality idea. So if you're doing processing by incremental prediction, you have a lossy model of memory. That gives you this prediction that processing is going to be difficult whenever any words that predict each other are far from each other, not just words in dependencies, but any words that have a predictive relationship with each other as measured by mutual information. And I claim that this actually generalizes dependency locality because the words that predict each other the most are the words in syntactic dependencies, which I'll give evidence for right now. So this is a study where we were trying to see whether it's the case that words in syntactic dependencies are also those words that predict each other most strongly in terms of mutual information. So we took a very large corpus of text. We used the Common Crawl web text for English for this. And we measured the mutual information between pairs of words. So concretely, we took sentences like this. These are dependency parsed sentences, although not universal dependencies. And we measure the mutual information using the formula between the part of speech tags for the words in one case in yellow, and between the lexical forms, which we're going to show in orange on the plot. And then what we want to say is that for words in dependencies, they have more mutual information than other words. So we compare that then to other pairs of words at the same distance, which are not in dependencies. And what we get is something like this. So in the solid lines here, we have dependencies, and we have higher mutual information for words in dependencies than for matched pairs that are not in dependencies. And we also see here that as you have growing dependency distance, you have a fall off of the mutual information. So that again is information locality. As words are farther from each other in linear order, they typically are less predictive of each other. Or as words are less predictive of each other, it's okay for them to be farther from each other. So that was building up information locality in terms of cognitive constraints on language. What does this now tell us about language structure? There's growing evidence for this in online processing, which I'm not going to present today, but I can point you to it. The simple prediction about language structure is that words that predict each other should be close to each other, generalizing dependency locality. This has been observed in a number of large-scale studies. Now, I'm going to show a specific example of information locality, which I think is particularly intuitive and powerful, which is adjective order. So if I ask you to describe this, ask you, where are the kittens? Where are the very cute kittens? You might say that they're in the big brown box. So you might say they're in the big brown box, and that sounds good. But if I say they're in the brown big box, that sounds kind of weird, right? That sounds like it's either wrong or it sounds like it's expressing some kind of marked meaning, right? So we'd say this is thumbs up and this is thumbs down. Do people agree with us? This is usually a pretty strong intuition, at least for native speakers of languages with these kinds of ordering constraints. So what's going on here? We can think about this in terms of information locality, in terms of mutual information. So let's think about the mutual information between adjectives and nouns. Which is to say, how much predictive information is each adjective giving you about each noun? It's just the log probability ratio for nouns given adjectives divided by the probability of a noun, as you could estimate from a corpus. When we measure that, we get that brown and box have high mutual information, relatively high, 1.14 bits. Big and box have lower mutual information, 1.01 bits. These are actual estimates from corpora. And so if you were to order things like this, you'd be putting the more predictive adjective farther from the noun. If you order it like this, you're putting the more predictive adjective close to the noun. And by the way, I think it makes sense why brown and box have high mutual information. That means they covary strongly. Boxes are often brown, especially if they're cardboard. That's a fact of how our world is structured. Whereas just about anything could be big or small. So the adjective big can kind of go with any noun. The adjective brown sort of prefers to go with something like box. And so that's why you get this pattern of MI. And I think that's why you get this pattern of order. If you imagine now you have sort of lossy memory and comprehension or production, then it would be bad to put the more predictive adjective farther from the noun. So I'm going to show corpus evidence now that this actually is a good predictor of adjective order across languages. This is one in a series of corpus studies we did, where we were looking at the order of adjectives in cases where you have two adjectives modifying one noun across languages. We call this an AAN triple. So from the universal dependencies corpora, we extract these syntactic structures where you have two adjectives modifying a noun. And then we see, well, how well can you predict the order of those two adjectives modifying the noun? And we investigated mutual information as a predictor here under the theory I just showed you. We also investigated many other proposed predictors of adjective order from the existing literature, including the subjectivity of adjectives and many, many other predictors. Here's the results we get across languages. This is going to be a table showing whether you get a significant effect for each predictor in each language we looked at. So we looked at several languages that have several different word order types. And each column here is a proposed predictor of adjective order from the existing literature. And the plus or the minus is telling you if there's a significant effect. And the plus is telling you that if this number is higher than the adjective is going later, and a minus means if the number is higher, the adjective is going, sorry, I flipped that. If the number is high, I'll explain it when I go to the sorry, it's a sign flip in my mind there. The important thing is mutual information. Mutual information is the only predictor we looked at that gives you a significant effect in predicting adjective order across all of the languages we looked at. The minus here means that when you have higher mutual information with a noun, then the adjective is going later, which means closer to the noun in a language like English where adjectives precede nouns. You get a plus here in the languages like Arabic, where the adjectives go after the noun, meaning that the adjective with higher mutual information is going earlier. So the signs of these effects match up with the theory, and this is the only theory that gives you significant predictions in every language that we looked at. So we developed a more powerful model of language processing based on incremental prediction with lossy memory. We derived information locality, a generalization of dependency locality. Way to think about it's like this. In dependency locality, we had these sort of pairwise relationships among syntactically dependent words, and we thought those all need to be close to each other. Now we're sort of generalizing that into this web of predictive relationships among all the words, where those predictive relationships are just mutual information. And the idea is that the words that predict each other now want to be close to each other. And this makes predictions that go beyond dependency locality, letting you predict things like adjective order. The upshot is that it looks like so far word order is structured in a way that supports incremental prediction in the way that humans do it. So that's information locality. Now we're going to go into predictive information, which is like the most generalized form of these ideas, and it turns out to be the most powerful form of these ideas. So far we've developed the idea that words are ordered in a way that supports incremental prediction by placing words that predict each other close to each other. But the previous model was based on really simple models of memory. I just said your memory is like fading with time, and that was very simple. It's not the most principled thing. We ended up with a theory that really only operates on pairwise relationships among words, and it only really predicts the order of words. But I think we can go further. I think this idea of information locality is actually much more powerful than just a theory of word order. I think it actually can predict many more fundamental things. And here's a little hint in that direction from the literature. So what even is a word? It's actually not clear what a word is as a category across languages. But one thing it might correspond to is that words seem to correspond to units of internal predictability. This is an interesting observation made by Mansfield here. So he looked at what is it that distinguishes something you would call two words in a phrase versus a morpheme attached to a word versus two morphemes inside a word. And he measured the mutual information between those two parts. And he found that the things we call phrases tend to have lower mutual information among their parts. The things we call words tend to have more mutual information among their parts. It looks like something even as basic as like the contiguity of what we call words might be a kind of information locality. These units that predict each other very strongly, they really want to be close to each other. And so we have concatenation of morphemes in words. So now we're going to develop a more principled view of memory constraints based on fundamental information theoretic limits. So this is a highly principled model expressing constraints that have to hold for humans or for any incremental predictor. And we're going to show that this explains some basic properties of morphology, looking now inside words instead of just looking at word order. So we've seen that language processing is characterized by incremental prediction under something like memory constraints. Now, in order to characterize that memory constraint, I'm going to ask how much information would any incremental predictor have to store or use in memory about the past in order to predict the future, where the past is everything I've said so far and the future is everything I will say. So what's like the minimum that any ideal predictor would have to store in order to predict the future? This is given to us by this quantity called predictive information. So you imagine thinking about language as like a stream you could think about it as a stream of acoustic input, but let's just think about it as a stream of discrete like phonemes represented here as letters, just so you can read it. You can imagine splitting that stream at some arbitrary point. And that defines something you'd call the past and something you'd call the future. So that's x up to time t, x before this particular time point here, and x greater than t, which is after this time point here. Let's call it the past and the future. Then the predictive information is the mutual information between the entire past and the entire future. So it's the amount of information that the past contributes towards predicting the future. This is the same mutual information measure as before, although now it's an average over all the possible pasts and futures within this stream of phonemes or letters or characters or whatever that you're getting in language. So no longer now operating at the word level, but now at like the smallest possible units. So this idea of predictive information is a measure of memory requirement that has to hold for any incremental predictor. any incremental predictor that predicts as well as it could has to store at least this much information in memory. You could not build something in our universe that uses less information than this and still predicts optimally. This comes from statistical physics. I did not invent this. I stole it out of these statistical physics papers. It goes under many different names in those papers, so you should just be aware of that if you want to look it up. And it's mostly applied in neuroscience and in control theory. It's been applied in neuroscience to characterize like how much information and neurons are storing about the past in order to predict the future inputs. But it has not been applied to language, at least in the way that I'm doing it. It has been applied to language in terms of large-scale text. It has not been applied at the level of like morphological structure. So how do you actually get the number on this? This might seem like a kind of crazy thing. It's like the amount of information that the entire past is giving you about the entire future. It turns out it's actually very easy to calculate a number for this from a corpus. And if you look at how that's done, it actually tells you a lot about what this means, what this number means. So let's think about this stream. I saw a cat with a dog, this stream of phonemes, the string of language that we have here. We're going to find something called n-gram surprisal. That's the average surprisal given a block of n-1 symbols. So like S1 is the unigram surprisal for the signal. It's like you imagine sliding a window of size 1 over the signal here, over the utterance here. And that's just going to give you some distribution on the individual phonemes. And you can plot that in a space like this. So that would be the unigram surprisal for this bit of the language. Then you can think about the bigram surprisal. And that's now you're thinking about each letter in a context of one previous letter, or each phoneme in a context of one previous phoneme. And so that's telling you how well can you predict each unit here given one previous unit. How unpredictable is one unit given one previous unit, and that goes there. And then you can think about the trigram surprisal. Now you're predicting one thing given two previous things. And then you can keep on doing this, and you get a nice curve like this. And what these numbers are telling you is, as you look at successively more and more context, how much easier is it getting to predict things? And eventually you'll hit an asymptote. Eventually you get to a point where, as you're looking at more and more context, it's not helping you anymore. That asymptote is called the entropy rate. And the predictive information that we're looking for is just the area under this curve. You just add up these differences to the entropy rate. So what the predictive information is telling you is something like, how much information are you getting from looking at the context, and how much context do you have to look at to get it? So like if this curve goes down really fast, that means that you can get all of the predictive information only by looking at a little bit of a window there. But if this goes down very slowly, that means that in order to predict things, you have to look at a very, very big context. And so you can already see how this is going to give you something like information locality. If you're minimizing predictive information, then you're going to want things that predict each other to be close to each other so that this curve goes down fast. So that's a principled cognitive constraint on language. Now we're going to think about what this means for language structure. What does language look like if it minimizes predictive information? If it minimizes this just general measure of how much information you have to store about the past to predict the future? First thing you can predict is that words and morphemes that predict each other want to be close to each other. I'm not going to be talking about that. I just gave you the logic for that. The theory does let you generalize from words to morphemes within words, which lets you predict morpheme order, which is nice. But what's more exciting is that you can predict actually something much more basic, which is that morphemes are usually contiguous in languages. They're usually combined by something like agglutination or concatenation. There are, of course, non-concatenative processes in like Semitic languages, and there's phonological alternations. But overall, usually you're just concatenating words and morphemes together, maybe with some alternations around the boundaries. Also, even more basically, what you get from this is that morphemes should express meaning in a way that is systematic. They should express grammatical features in a way that is systematic. Both of these things follow from minimizing predictive information, which I'll show in a corpus study here. So here is the morphology of a Hungarian noun. It's nice and agglutinative. So this is the word ember, which means person. And you can see that plural is indicated by an ek suffix, which is concatenated onto the end of the stem there. And then the case is indicated by case endings, which are concatenated after the plural ending there. So this is a nice agglutinative system. There's vowel harmony here. There's a non-local process here. But other than that, it's a concatenative system, an agglutinative system. And this is not atypical across languages of the world. And there's 231 more forms like this. So we can imagine what would Hungarian look like if it were not concatenated, if it were not local in this way. So this is a randomized version of Hungarian where I just shuffled the order of instead of taking the morphemes and concatenating them together as you do in the real language, I just shuffled the order of the phonemes here. This is like an extremely non-concatenative version of Hungarian where you're like interleaving the morphemes together. And even if you just look at this, you can kind of get a sense for why this would be bad in terms of information locality. When you have concatenation, all the information about plurality is nice and local within the form. When you have this non-local, non-concatenative thing, the information is sort of spread out throughout the entire form, and you have predictive information at a distance. You can also imagine a non-systematic version of Hungarian. So what I've done here, there's a question there. I'm sorry if there were questions earlier, I didn't see them. I actually am not sure how to pull that up. Sorry.
It's not a question, it's fine. We're just doing a bit of bookkeeping on the Q&A afterwards. Sorry, carry on.
Okay. So this is non-systematic Hungarian. So this is what Hungarian might look like if you did not have a systematic correspondence between the grammatical features and the parts of the form here. And I generated this just by shuffling the assignment of forms to meanings. So this is, in terms of phonotactics, this is perfectly great. It's a perfectly great Hungarian-like language. But now there's no longer any systematic relationship between the forms and the meanings. And what we're going to see is that the actual Hungarian language here has lower predictive information than what you would get under these kinds of configurations. And we're going to see that not only in Hungarian, but also in Hungarian, Turkish, Finnish, and Latin, which are the set of languages where I had the right data that I needed to do this kind of study. The idea is we're really interested in the morphology. So I'm going to reduce the noun forms to only the affixes. So like not considering the stem, at least for now. You can estimate probabilities for the grammatical features underlying these forms simply from universal dependencies. The universal dependencies is annotated for grammatical features. So you can just count how often you have features in universal dependencies. And then we can compare predictive information for the real systematic forms against non-systematic baselines where I've disrupted the systematic structure and the non-concatenative baselines where I've disrupted the local structure. Prediction is that the attested form should have lower predictive information than these baselines. So to be clear, what I've done is I've taken something like Hungarian, I've gotten the probabilities, the frequencies of these features from a corpus, completely empirical feature frequencies. And we compare that then to 1,000 versions of a non-concatenative version of Hungarian and 1,000 versions of a non-systematic version of Hungarian. And we measure predictive information using the formula from earlier. Here's what we get. So the actual predictive information for the actual Hungarian noun morphology is like 2.6 bits. There it is in the black line. When we look at the non-concatenative, non-local baselines, we get much higher predictive information. This is the distribution over predictive information you get over 1,000 samples. When you look at the non-systematic baseline, again, much higher predictive information. I also look here at non-systematic baselines where I'm shuffling the assignments of forms to meanings here, but I'm preserving the lengths of the forms. And that still gives you higher predictive information than you get in the actual Hungarian language. And we see that also in the other languages we're looking at. The actual language has lower predictive information than a majority of these baselines. And in the case of Finnish and Hungarian and Turkish, the actual morphology is nice and agglutinative in vowel harmony, again, with all of those cases. And we see a lot of like minimization with respect to the baselines there. In Latin here, again, the language does have lower predictive information than all those baselines, but it's less. Again, there's less of a minimization effect here, just like we saw in dependency locality. And I think that actually makes sense though, because Latin is not really agglutinative. Its morphology is not really very systematic. If you remember your Latin grammar, It's actually quite fusional. It's actually hard to find a particularly systematic pattern in the Latin morphology here. And so it's no surprise that it ends up with higher predictive information relative to the baselines. So we introduced a principled information theoretic measure of memory complexity called predictive information, showed evidence that languages are structured in a way that produces that predictive information. That predicts locality among and within words, including like the contiguity of morphemes within words. And it predicts systematicity, excitingly, in the assignment of forms to meanings. This extremely basic property of language seems to come out from this idea of information locality generalized now, not just to be about words, but to be about all levels, about the smallest levels of analysis. How am I on time?
You've got about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. I thought I'm okay. So now I've built up this sort of theory for language structure. And now as a sort of very interesting side note to this, it turns out that this view of language structure is actually quite informative about how language models work. So we're now confronted in the science of language with these things, these large neural networks that appear to be able to produce what appears to be fluent grammatical text. Things like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever these things you can interact with. The interesting thing, or one of the many interesting things about these models, is that they acquire these language models acquire non-trivial linguistic structure from training on text data. So the way these things are actually built is you first train a model on a huge amount of text data, and from that it essentially learns the language. And then you do some additional reinforcement learning on top of that in order to make it behave, in order to make it respond to user queries and stuff. But the underlying base model, the underlying foundation model for these things is nothing but an incremental text predictor. So they're trained to do incremental prediction. They're trained to minimize the surprisal of each word given context. The same thing that we saw was going on in human language processing. So they're minimizing surprisal of a word given a context. This is literally all they do until you start the reinforcement learning. And what's interesting is that their ability to pick up on the structure of language actually seems to be tied up with the fact that they're doing this kind of incremental prediction. So this is a very interesting study from Ahuja et al. It's not my study, where they were looking at the ability of language models to learn to generalize based on syntactic dependencies. So they were looking at sentences like this. This is something like the keys to the cabinet sit on the shelf, and there's a dependency between the subject keys and the verb sit. And one way you can tell that is the form of the verb depends on the fact that the subject is plural here. And so the question they were looking at is, well, if I train my language model on sentences like this, the keys are pretty, I lost the keys to the cabinet, the key is rusty. If you train on sentences like this, where the subject is always adjacent to the verb, then can you pick up on this agreement pattern here based on syntactic dependencies? So based on this controlled training data, where the verb is always next to a subject in the training data. So the training data is perfectly consistent with a generalization that says a form of a verb should just depend on the previous noun, no matter what the dependency structure is. But that would not be the right generalization for language. So what you would hope for is that even if you train on data like this, you would still end up with this generalization like this, where the form of a verb depends on the syntactic dependency, the syntactic subject of that verb. And the interesting finding from this paper was that if you train a language model on language modeling, if you train a language model to predict words from context, then they do very well at this. So this is the accuracy of a language model in predicting the right syntactic verb form, the same one that humans prefer, in sentences like this. And you see that with enough training, then you do actually get the structural syntactic generalization based on the training data. However, if you train on anything else, like if you try to train a neural network to convert one sequence to another, like to convert say, a past tense sentence into a present tense sentence, then you don't get the generalization. So you get zero accuracy. What this means is that when you're training the neural network to do this sequence to sequence conversion task, then it is inflecting the verb to depend on the adjacent noun instead of the syntactic subject noun. So it looks like only when you are doing actual language modeling do you get the right structural generalizations in a language model. And when you're doing something else, you don't get them. And I think this is because, as we've discussed, the structure of language is set up in a way that supports incremental prediction, which is the task here, the same task that language models are usually doing when they're trained. So previously, we saw that language is structured in a way that supports incremental prediction, minimizing the memory resources you have to use during incremental prediction. And we just saw that and what I'm going to argue now is that language models succeed in part because they are also doing this kind of incremental prediction. If that's true, then we can make a prediction. If we disrupt the local predictive structure in language, like we saw in all the previous sections, then language models are not going to be able to learn as well from text data. So if we mess up the information locality in human language, then we predict language models are not going to be as good at learning human language anymore. So this work was inspired in part by claims from Noam Chomsky and associates that language models are not interesting models of human language because the claim is that language models can learn to produce impossible languages, not generated by the principles governing all known human languages, just as well as, if not better than, natural language output and cannot distinguish between them. So the claim is that language models, they can learn anything, basically. They can learn any sequence pattern. And so the fact that they learn language is maybe not so interesting if they do learn language. But we're going to show that this claim is actually not true. So languages actually become harder for large language models to learn when you disrupt their linguistic structure, and in particular, when you disrupt the local predictive structure that we've been discussing. So what we're going to do here is this in the study, we are training language models based on text and based on English text, the child-directed English text. And we are measuring how well the language model is doing at predicting things, which is the usual measure of language model accuracy. So the first language we look at is what we call no shuffle. And we're going to look at then at a bunch of shuffle languages. But the first language is no shuffle. This is just the actual English corpus text. So here's an example sentence. He cleans his very messy bookshelf, normal sentence. It ends up being split into tokens like this. And this is the kind of learning curve you get for a GPT-2 architecture on this training data. So this is perplexity, which is basically the same thing as surprisal. It's just 2 to the power of surprisal. And so you can see that as you keep training, then the model, it gets better and better. It eventually learns to predict the text quite well. Now we can compare that to a language where we have destroyed all the information in the word order in the language. So this is what we call non-deterministic shuffle. So we've taken each sentence and we've completely randomly shuffled the word order in each sentence. This is creating a language which is unlike any known human language. This is a language where there are absolutely no restrictions on word order within sentences, where the word order within a sentence is just completely random. And when you do that, it's a lot harder to learn. So the language model, even after a lot of training, it is not able to predict things very well. So when you disrupt the word order of a language, it does make the language harder to learn. But the non-deterministic shuffle is maybe not so interesting because in addition to destroying the word order rules, this is also just making the language inherently more random because you're actually shuffling things. You're actually making the language inherently harder to predict. And so maybe it's not surprising that language models have difficulty learning that. So this next thing is called deterministic shuffle. The idea here is that you're going to shuffle again the word order within each sentence, but you're going to do it in a way that's consistent. So every time you shuffle the word order within each sentence, you're applying a fixed permutation. It's like this. You're taking 2 different sentences and you are applying some deterministic permutation. That permutation is random, but it's the same every time. The result of that is that you are you're not injecting randomness into the language. The language is no more random than it ever was. But what you are is you're creating these extremely complicated word order rules, these like extremely complicated scrambling rules for each sentence. So the language still has all of its linguistic structure, but now there are these very complicated word order rules that are going to create like crossing dependencies. It's not going to follow a context-free grammar anymore, these kinds of things. And indeed, these kinds of things are much harder to learn for the language model. And I think it has to do with the fact that when you shuffle in this way, you're taking all those elements that are close to each other because they predict each other, and you're shuffling them very far from each other. Now all the predictive information is shuffled into a large distance. And you can see that if you do the same deterministic shuffling, but within a small window, so you are moving words still deterministically, you still have these very complex word order rules, but you're still keeping related words relatively close together, then that's still harder to learn than the actual language, but it's a bit easier. So what we've seen here overall, we saw that language is structured in a way that supports incremental prediction, which gave us this idea that units should be predictable from local contexts. I think language models succeed in part because they also do incremental prediction. And what we've seen is that they struggle to learn when we disrupt exactly that local predictive structure of language. If you take away the information locality, which is tied up in these very basic properties of language, then it's harder for the language model to learn it. It's not the case that they could just learn anything. They do prefer to learn things like human language because human language has information locality. So, concluding, we took a functional view of human language, thinking about the constraints that language is operating under. We thought about constraints in basically real-time production and comprehension. We saw that that gave us a model which is quite similar to what we get with language models. Language models are just thetas that are predicting a word given previous words. The reason that this kind of connection is possible is because when you're taking this sort of functional level view, that means that you can see the unities, you can see the connections between the natural systems, like actual human language, and the artificial systems, like incremental next token predictors, which it turned out are fairly effective at learning and using human language. We thought about cognitive constraints on language and models of language structure based on them. We saw that memory constraints and online processing led to different kinds of locality in human language, elements that are relevant to each other or close. We saw that increasingly sophisticated models of memory gave us increasingly powerful models of what we mean by locality. Takeaways are, I think, language is structured in a way that supports incremental prediction from local context. Main takeaway, maybe. It's expected if language is under a sequential information bottleneck. I think language models succeed because they are also performing incremental prediction under a memory bottleneck. And overall, what we've seen is a bridge using information theory between the form and the function of language, where the function is determined by communication under constraints, and the form has to do with having a system that lets you do that lets you communicate under those constraints. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to my great collaborators.
Thanks for a fantastic talk, Richard. So we're going to move to the panel discussion phase now. Just for people watching remotely, you can, if you want to ask a text question that I'll read out, you can type your question in the Q&A box. If you want to ask the question yourself, then you can try raising your hand and we'll see if we can unmute you when the time comes. Okay, but panel discussion first. Martin, if you're ready, I'll go to you. Martin?
Yes, can you hear me? My internet
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my internet connection seems to be a bit unstable, so just to be on the safe side, I'm kind of typing some questions into the chat here. So one question I had, is there anything in your account that sort of presupposes a distinction between words and phrases? I've been very interested in the nature of morphology that many linguists have sort of, emphasized as sort of very important. But it seems to me that for you, you could simply ignore that, right? You had these two steps. First, phrasal structures, and then you went into morphology. But could you do the same, without completely ignoring that distinction? So that was one question I had. Another, you didn't really talk about evolution, even though this is supposed to be a lecture series on language evolution. And it seems to me when considering language history, uh, and we see some reflections of these functional motivation that you talked about, but many languages are not very functional, at least at first blush. So you mentioned German word order, for example, which is really famous. Anyone who tries to learn German word order, despairs. So could it be that these functional motivations are pretty weak, and therefore uh, we see them only when we look at lots of languages, but not necessarily when we just look at one or a few languages? Okay.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so regarding words and phrases, yeah, so the final theory I predicted based on predictive information has no presuppositions about levels of analysis, like words and phrases, or it's really just operating on the smallest time scale that you could imagine. And in my view, I would like to have a theory where the theory itself is not presupposing any particular levels of structure, but rather those levels of structure sort of emerge from the theory. And the way I think about it is that as you go from morphemes to words to phrases to sentences to discourses, what you're seeing is just things that are less and less tightly bound by information locality. So like morphemes are basically like the larger units you're looking at, the weaker these sort of pressures for locality are getting. And the sort of, yeah, so you end up with a fuzzy distinction between words and phrases. If you were to build something like that in, the way I think it would go in would be something like if you want to maintain a distinction between words and phrases, I think what that's going to look like is sort of like you have predictive information. You could imagine figuring out the predictive information at different time scales. And it might look quite different at different time scales. And you might even have conflicts between the different time scales. And I think that's how you would end up having a distinction between words and phrases. Regarding evolution, yeah. So there's a lot of work on like, can you find evidence for languages actually getting shorter and shorter dependencies over evolutionary time? And the way I think about it is, well, first of all, I wouldn't say that the evidence is uniformly weak. So there's an interesting paper from my student Michael Hahn where they were looking at like phylogenetic evidence for dependency. They were thinking about dependency in locality and information locality. And they had a very interesting phylogenetic model where it does seem like you do see evidence for they were actually thinking about it as a trade-off between the dependency locality and the information locality, but where languages are moving around on that trade-off. Actually, if I go way back, let me go back to a slide here on the landscape slide. I found that's a very useful slide. So here, and then the idea was that you have complexity and informativity. And yeah, so you could say, well, what if complexity is just dependency length? That's how I used to think about it. So I think the way to think about it is you don't actually expect languages to be in minima of this landscape. You don't expect them to have completely minimal dependency length because A, there's random chance factors in evolution. And B, there's other, like if you think dependency length is the only thing, then you're ignoring all the other functional pressures on language. Furthermore, So I'd expect languages to, that's why these are sort of English, Mandarin, and Walbury here are sort of off center. They're not exactly in the middle, but you expect languages to be close to the bottoms in terms of this fitness landscape. I also think that when you think about the languages that are up here, like the really bad languages, that's not like German. That's like non-deterministic shuffle. Like the really bad languages are things that you would absolutely never find in human languages. And like the amount of variance you find in actual human languages is still within like a parameter regime where the dependency lengths are still fairly short. If you look at the big dependency length plot, you see that. So there is some minimization in all of the languages. There's variance in how much. But like, so the black lines here are the actual languages and the colored ones are the different baselines. It's true that there's variance among the languages, but none of them are anywhere near like the dotted purple line, which is completely random rearrangements of the sentence. There's nothing nearly close to that. And so I think these functional pressures are not necessarily going to be operating in evolutionary time because in evolutionary time, you're already operating within a regime that's pretty good. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Shira for the next questions.
Yeah.
You need a microphone. Yes, sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for an extremely beautiful talk. I'm curious if your
Oh, I'm sorry. The audio went out right when you started the question. I'm sorry.
I was asking how does learning meshes things with a general account? So is it in line, like are the predictions or is the pressure coming from learning is in essence in line with the pressure coming from processing? So what you showed about large language models, it shows us that, I mean, what I took from this is that the pressures are similar, but I was wondering whether you think the same is true for human learning or more specifically child learners. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think basically incremental prediction is very important in human learning too. And it's different from the language models. Humans have worse memory than the language models. So I think humans are going to have more of this kind of to the extent that memory pressures are affecting how well you can learn using incremental prediction, humans are going to have more of those effects than the language models do. Yeah, as for how learning fits in, yeah, I've actually only started thinking about it fairly recently, but I actually think the information locality idea does fit very well with learning under very reasonable and general models. So something that's very important in learning is redundancy. So like very often you see a word in context, you've never seen it before, but you can still figure out what it means. I feel like that's probably how you learn like most maybe of the words that you know. And what that shows is that that word was redundant, which is to say it was predictable in that context. And so redundancy in language supports learnability in this way. And if you imagine that you have limited memory, or if you maybe imagine that as a child, you have limited ability to attend to anything for too long, then you can imagine that as you're learning, you're trying to predict things, but it's given a potentially disrupted or noisy memory. Maybe it's disrupted because your memory is weak. Maybe it's disrupted because you weren't really paying attention, and now you're paying attention to the linguistic signal. So basically, local redundancy. When you have redundancy in term like local redundancy, then that should support learnability under very general learning models. You can make that claim even without claiming what the prior is that people are using when learning. And that's the same thing as predictive information. So I think it actually does. But again, this is mostly like what I've just told you is as far as I've thought about it. I don't have experimental results on it yet. But yeah, I think learning does align with these ideas.
Can I ask another question? So do you think, is there any other force that you can think of that would pull or push languages to a different direction? Like that would work in contrast to the processing / learning pressure?
Well, I think then you
No,
get
it's
into
also an answer.
Well, it depends on what you count as processing. I mean, there's articulation, right? We have to be able to actually produce things. So there's physiological articulation costs. Um, and but going in the other direction, I think the other kinds of pressures you would get would be basically pressures on what meanings you're expressing. And that's where you start getting into how language is used for things like social signaling. And yeah, I think there's a wide and there's a big there's a lot to be worked out on that side of the equation. Basically, in the informativity part of the equation, what are we actually trying to inform each other about? I think there's a huge amount of interesting work to be done there.
Thanks.
Okay, so we now have a few minutes for audience Q&A. I'm gonna come to in one moment to a question online from Simon Kirby. So Simon, get ready to unmute yourself. But while you sort yourself out, just a quick question from me. So Richard, it's a great talk. The stuff about neural networks being in language modeling being the kind of the right task to train them on, in a sense. My understanding of the recent evolution of the technology behind those networks is that they're kind of designed to be less and less constrained to local contexts. So like simple recurrent networks weren't great because they were too local. LSTMs took some of the brakes off on locality, and transformers are like hyper not local. So I wonder how I find your argument very persuasive, but I wonder why the machinery matters for language modeling.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah. So language models have gotten better as they've lifted the memory restrictions. And there's a ton of interesting work to be done in exploring how that affects the time course for learning different aspects of language. The way I think about it is that, yeah, SRNs and LSTMs had limited memory, but it wasn't limited in the way humans was. And so they weren't aligned. And so as those memory restrictions on the models have gone away and the models have just gotten more generally powerful, then yeah, it's like it's true that I will make the claim that if you have the right memory model as a constraint in your language model, you should be able to learn like syntactic structure faster. I do think that's true. I haven't shown that yet, but I will make that claim, and you can maybe prove me wrong. But yeah, I think the SRNs and the LSTMs were just not the right. They were just not the right memory structure. And furthermore, if you think about what you're learning in language modeling, you're actually learning a lot more than the structure of language. You're learning also all the world knowledge encoded in language. You're learning how to reason. You're learning tons, like in terms of how much language models are learning and what proportion of that is really knowledge about language, it's probably mostly not about language. It's probably mostly about that other stuff. And when it comes to learning about that other stuff, you want the most powerful model, the most power, like, and transformers are that. So I think if you're, this is actually something we're trying, like getting better memory constraints in transformers.
Okay.
Also, I'll point out that there is some evidence that transformers are not so. So there's cool evidence from like So Ryu and Rick Lewis, and also Tal Linzen and William, I think something Timke, where they claim that transformers are actually reasonable psycholinguistic models for human memory.
Lovely. Thank you. Simon, if you're ready, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Richard, that was a spectacular talk. Thanks so much. It got increasingly mind-blowing as it went on, which is very satisfying.
Appreciate it.
I want to confess a sort of sense of slight frustration in a way, and I think this relates to Martin's question about evolution, because what you've set up is this kind of beautiful account of what I've previously called a puzzle of fit, right?
Yeah.
You've got this structure of language, and then you've got this in some sense this objective function that it seemed to be optimally designed for. But you've not told us why it should be so, right? So the distinction between this and the case of the feathers and the wing and so on is that there's this enormous piece of machinery out there in biological evolution to explain the puzzle of fit.
Mhm.
So I've started, you mentioned things like heavy NP shift in English. Now those are cases where speakers on the fly can rearrange aspects of their language while they're doing planning in order to presumably optimize these locality principles and make and optimize for predictive information. But that's a very different kind of thing than the grammaticalized word order of language. And
Yeah.
it feels to me like what you've presented is the start of a program where we're now in urgent need of explaining how on earth does language optimize? Why is it optimized? Have you had any thoughts on how to approach that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I have had thoughts, but nothing that gets to the point where I could like write a paper on it yet. But so uh so yeah, the way I think about it is eventually this fitness landscape, this objective function, should give you evolutionary dynamics. And those dynamics might look like something like it's a lot of random noise plus a little nudge in the direction of being more optimal. But yeah, I think yeah, so I would like for like I think the best version of this theory would be one where these functional pressures are all active in actual online language use, and you can see evidence for them in actual evolutionary time. It could also be that, I hesitate to say it because I like aesthetically don't like the idea, but it could be that you have innate biases, and what those innate biases are is they've biased you towards languages that have information locality. And in that case, you would expect that as language evolves, maybe your level of locality is going to fluctuate a little bit within a range that's still pretty good, but it's never going to get incredibly horribly bad like those baseline languages. I think that is plausible. The reason I haven't advocated it in that way is because I feel like that view is less falsifiable. But I think it is possible. It is possible that there is, there is an innate component, but I think that what that innate component is, if it exists, is a bias towards these kinds of local languages.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're virtually out of time, but there's a couple of questions online. Richard, I'm going to ask you one of these and request a like super short answer, and then we have to call it a day. So this is from Agatha. She says, "Can you elaborate on the memory constraint? Humans can remember information that was said long ago, but they have troubles with dependencies in a sentence."
Yeah, great question. I can answer that very quickly. It's not that you forget, it's that you can't access it fast enough. And there's a lot of evidence for this. It's not the storage that's difficult, it's the usage of memory.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, we're out of time. So thanks again to our speaker and our panelists. Okay, and that's the end of today's talk. We're back again one more time next week with Martin Haspelmatt. He's going to be talking about universals of language and convergent diachronic evolution. Martin's going to be joining us in person in Edinburgh, but as usual, we'll be streaming live online. And Martin's talk will be finished by followed by